I hope you find this discussion quite useful, but I also hope to learn a lot from you, because I know you have so many experiences and you have gone through a lot of macroeconomic issues, which I'll be touching on today. My name is Irene Forichi, and I'm a Zimbabwean national. I did my primary and secondary school in Zimbabwe, and I did my first degree in agriculture at the University of Zimbabwe between 1989 and 1991. And then 1994 to 95, I did my master's in the United Kingdom, and it was in land and water management, specializing on irrigation water management. And between 2001 and 2005, I was at Cornell University in the USA doing my PhD. And in terms of my work experience, I worked in the public sector within the government of Zimbabwe, in the Ministry of Agriculture, for about 14 years, where I was working as a research officer on agronomy, horticulture, and agroforestry. And then I spent 2 years with the International Center for Research in Agroforestry, also based in Zimbabwe, but as their country representative for their program in the country. Then, just before I came here, I had spent about 3 years working for the United Nations, specifically the Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, and I was based at their Regional Emergency Office in Johannesburg, and I was the Regional Emergency Agronomist. In the last session, I think Jason had asked what it means as the Regional Emergency Agronomist, and I'd explained that I was responsible for working with countries in the FAO system to respond to agricultural emergencies after disasters such as droughts or floods or any other factors that would cause farmers to be vulnerable or lose their crops. Yeah. Okay, like I said, I was born in Zimbabwe, and this is my rural home. This is where I was born and grew up. I'll be focusing on Southern Africa today, and I'm not so sure how many of you are very familiar with Southern Africa, so I put this world map just to show where Africa is and to show where Southern Africa is, and also blowing it up to show the countries that I'll be talking about specifically. I'll be talking about 15 countries in the SADC region, but I won't specifically mention all of them every time. The 15 countries include the inland and also some of the islands in the Indian Ocean, like Madagascar, Mauritius, Seychelles.
What does SADC stand for?
Oh, okay. SADC stands for Southern African Development Community. And it's a community of all these countries that was formed as a way of trying to promote the member states to address issues that were commonly affecting them in terms of their economic development or economic welfare and other issues like politics. Within the farming setup of Southern Africa, I'm going to focus on the smallholder farming sector, but I just wanted to highlight the various forms of farming that are available. There are farmers who do not own any livestock or any animals, so they cannot use any draft power to prepare the land, and they can just use a hand hoe. Then we have cattle. Other people use donkeys. And we then also have the commercialized system. And the main crop, the staple crop, is maize in the region, and is grown by most of the countries, although wheat is also particularly important. Then we have various legumes, which are either grown together as mixtures with corn. Maize is also corn. And then we also have nutritious vegetables that can also be grown together with the corn, and this is pumpkin. And in general, some of the main crops include maize or corn, which I've already mentioned, wheat, small grains such as sorghum, we have sugarcane, cotton, fruits, vegetables, tobacco, potatoes, sweet potatoes, cassava, plantation crops. The list is not exhaustive. I was just trying to give examples of the main crops. Then we have the horticultural crops like vegetables, and there's a lot of small livestock rearing by the smallholder farmers, and the numbers that they own, they can range from nothing to as many as 20 or 30 per household, depending on the region where they are coming from. Then chickens are common across most households. At least each household would have at least one chicken. And then we have cattle. In terms of human development indicators, I selected a few and also selected a few countries just to give an example. And the source of this information is from the UNICEF website. And I've highlighted in yellow where I thought maybe we could focus on, but you can also look at the rest. We have total adult literacy. You can see like Malawi has 73% of the adults being literate, South Africa 89, Zimbabwe 91. And primary school enrollment or attendance between 2005 to 2009, it was close to 90% across. And then the HIV and AIDS prevalence is quite high, and this has implications on human development. And then we have technological use or advances. An indication is the use of cell phones, and in 2008, like 12% of the population in Malawi had access to phones, 91% in South Africa, 13% in Zimbabwe. And internet is also quite low, only 2% of the population in Malawi, 8% in South Africa, 11% in Zimbabwe. Life expectancy is also variable across the countries, but as you can see, it's quite low, much lower than the life expectancy on average in developed countries. And maybe some of the reasons could be due to disease pandemics like HIV and AIDS, or also lack of access to medication. And then at the bottom here, we have the annual inflation rate, which was quite high in Zimbabwe and low in South Africa. But of importance is the high levels of poverty. Like 74% of the population in Malawi lives on less than $1.25 a day.
Can we, guys,
Okay.
any idea, the access to technology, she has the number of phones per 100 people and the number of internet users per 100 people. Do you think there is any connections between that and rural incomes, like farming incomes? Is that important for farmers, for people in the agricultural sector to have access to telephones? Matt?
Yeah, access to technology, then you can check what the average prices are for the same of the goods that you're growing. If you can't, then someone can buy the goods from you for a lot less than they were.
Would you agree with that? That
Yes.
communications technology increases like the incomes and efficiency with which farming occurs?
Yeah, exactly. And when I talk later about some of the constraints within the agricultural sector, communication, lack of communication or limited communication and information is one of them. Yeah.
The other thing that she didn't highlight here, that as an economist jumped out at me, was the GDP per capita growth rates, or in some cases negative growth rates, in Southern Africa between 1970 and 1990, but then even continuing over the last 20 years. You would think that, things must be improving, right? It's all about development. Development is what developing countries do, but does that look like development on the income side? You can see that the average Zimbabwean today is 2.3% poorer than they were 42 years ago. So that's not economic development. There's actually been kind of the reverse going on in some places. On the other hand, South Africa has had average incomes increase over the last 20 years. Yeah, sure.
Could I ask why in Zimbabwe the life expectancy in 1990 was actually higher than it is now?
Same with South Africa.
I think it's related to the HIV and AIDS pandemic. I think the first time when it was really reported maybe was probably around the 80s, and the incubation period probably helps to explain why the life expectancy was still high in 1990 but then fell. But also the economic hardships where people would not even get medication for simple things and then they would lose their life. Yeah.
Any other questions or observations on the human development indicators here? This is a slide that you will all want to put together for one country that you choose to research. And this is data you've already looked at. When we've experimented with Gapminder and the UN website, we've seen a lot of this sort of data. This is a small selection of some of the more key data that researchers find. Okay.
Okay, also of particular importance is the high level of hunger within the region that we are talking about. If you look at the key, this darkest color is 5, and it means greater than 35% of the population goes hungry, and you can see that a good number of the countries in Southern Africa fall within this category. In terms of population, the population varies from country to country, and small countries, if I may go back. Yeah. If you take note, there are some very small countries like Swaziland and Lesotho compared to, for example, South Africa and Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which are very big. And some of these countries, they rely a lot on the bigger countries for some economic development. The aggregate population for the region was 248 million people in 2006, and by 2010 it was 277 million, and this is just a graphic representation. But as you can observe, there's a steady increase in the population that is now staying in urban areas, and there's a steady decline in the population that is staying in rural areas. And there are various reasons for this. Job searches, because farming is not really viewed as economic within the smallholder farming setup, and people would prefer to go and look for alternative jobs. Then inflation levels, very high, like for the DRC, between 2008 and 2010, and for Zimbabwe, we had some negative growth in inflation. Maybe you can guess some of the reasons for this.
Anybody know why there was deflation in Zimbabwe in 2009? Zimbabwe is infamous for its inflation of like 2007, 2008. What happened in 2009? They adopted the US dollar, and of course they were very limited in supply, meaning there wasn't much money to go around in 2009. Prices fell. So that was when they switched over to the US dollar after their hyperinflation of 2008. A little monetary theory there.
Okay. And then the trends in GDP across the region, it's quite variable across the countries, but for South Africa, it continues to increase.
It's really just so much larger than any other country in the region.
Yeah, it is like the economic giant of Southern Africa.
Kind of like the Germany of Southern Africa. Well, here in Europe.
Oh, yeah. And then trends in the growth rates in GDP. We already discussed about the negative inflation. Here in Zimbabwe, it was negative annual growth rate. For most countries, it was positive, but still quite low. And specifically for the agricultural sector, its contribution or the growth in the annual GDP within the agricultural sector varied from being negative to being positive in some countries over the years, and this may be explained due to a number of reasons, like when there's a severe drought and output is lower for a certain year compared to the previous year, then they might register negative growth rate. I would like to focus now on how the agriculture sector contributes to economic development in the region. If you might be aware that up to 80% of the population in this region depends on agriculture, either farming to produce food for their daily consumption, or they get engaged to work in the agricultural sector as part-time laborers or full-time laborers. And the overall contribution of this sector to the national GDP is provided here. And it's quite high in some countries, like DRC, but none of them is above 50% And I think in the previous class, Mr. Walker noted that it's a very high proportion of people who are depending on a very low level of income, and it really might explain why poverty levels continue to prevail.
You guys get that ratio, right? In a region where 80% of the population works in agriculture, yet it makes up such a small proportion of the total income, you can see that this must result in an unequal distribution of income in this region, which itself can be an obstacle to economic development. So those two slides right there, 80% work in agriculture, yet it makes up on average around 20 or less % of the income of a nation. That's just, you just picture poverty, right? Impoverished farmers across much of Southern Africa. So many people in farming earning so little of the income. So that's why Dr. Forichi is here today. That's the field she works in, is raising the incomes of those farmers.
This is a whole list of some factors that might be contributing to the low potential or the low contribution of the agricultural sector towards national economies. We already talked about the high poverty levels, and because of the high poverty, people do not have the means to purchase inputs such as fertilizer or high quality seeds that may help them to boost their production. And there are issues of technological limitations. There is a lot of development in terms of technologies that help to increase productivity within the agricultural sector, but in the developed countries. In Southern Africa, some of these technologies are being tried or they are being tested for adaptation, but still there's a lot that still needs to be done in order to bring these improved techniques to the farmers. And we have issues like gender imbalance, policy limitations, limited or lack of financing. Then we have limited technical know-how or capacity, limited access to information, poor access to markets due to physical barriers, or simply sometimes the markets are not there. There are no centers where farmers can bring their produce to sell. They have to either get public transport to bring their produce to the market, and by the time they get there, depending on the nature of the produce, they would have either lost some of the produce, for example, the highly perishable vegetables. And then poor infrastructure, high post-harvest losses, limited diversity. Sometimes people are growing only a few types of crops, and when there are disasters, maybe all these types of crops are sensitive and they do not have anything to fall back on. And climate change issues, high land degradation, there are high levels of soil erosion, siltation of dams, and this impact on the capacity of the dams to hold water for irrigation or other development activities. Then pests and diseases, conflicts, unrest, and also low investment into the agricultural sector across the region. Most of the countries still invest very little of their national budgets to agriculture.
Guys, you can take any one of those bullet points and imagine them as an obstacle to economic development. When we, as I see this presentation, I'm picturing our IB syllabus. Section 5.3 is obstacles to economic development, right? Any one of these can be communicated as a poverty trap as well, which we now have lots of experience with, creating, brainstorming different types of poverty traps, poverty cycles. So there's a lot here, but you start to see that it's a bit more complex than the 2 or 3 bullet points that appear on our IB syllabus. Poor infrastructure, poor education, poor health. Those are obstacles to development. But when we look at just agriculture, there are, as probably many more than are even listed here. Things that prevent the development of an agricultural, of a high productivity agricultural sector, which then are keeping people in poverty. So picture this slide. These are the obstacles to developing a more productive agricultural sector.
Okay. We talked about high land degradation. This is a field where crops are just starting to grow and most of the topsoil is being washed away and the soils become infertile. And fertilizer use in the region is very low. If you look at this last column, it shows the total current capacity of using fertilizer. And if you can see, most of the countries are using very little fertilizer, or they are using fertilizer to a very limited extent. Probably Mauritius with 61%, but look at Mozambique, 6%, Zambia, 4%, and this was in 2008. And in the last session, I think there were discussions on why there's this low use of fertilizer. There are several reasons. The major one is that most of the countries in Southern Africa, except for South Africa, they do not generally produce their own fertilizer. They rely mostly on imported fertilizer, which is very expensive or might not be readily available. And also the high cost in relation to the poverty cycles that we talked about, they exacerbate the underuse of fertilizer. Then low investments into agriculture. If you look at most of the SADC countries, except for Zimbabwe and Malawi, who are above 10%, most of the countries are allocating lower than 10% of their national budget to agriculture. In 2002, there was an agreement by the heads of state of the African Union in a meeting in Mozambique that in order to boost growth and development in the region, there was need to increase investments into the agricultural sector. And the agreement was that by 2008, every member of states of the African Union should be investing at least 10% of their national budgets into agriculture in order to achieve a 6% minimum growth in the agricultural sector. But by 2007, you can see that most of the countries were still failing to meet that agreement. And because of all these issues, the productivity is very low. This is the maize yield in tons per hectare. Except for South Africa, most of the yields are still very low. Like when farmers grow maize, they don't obtain a lot per given area. So whatever they invest does not yield high returns.
Dr. Forichi said in the last class that the global average yield per hectare is around 4, did you say?
Yeah.
4 tons per hectare?
Yeah.
So only one country in the region is even achieving the global average. You can see that most countries are less than 25% of the global average. Some countries are only 10% of the global average as far as productivity in maize farming. So you can imagine that if you just compare that to the incomes, it's exactly inversely related, right? Higher maize yields equal higher incomes for maize farmers. Lower maize yields, I guess it's directly related. Lower incomes.
Yeah, let me know if you have any questions as we go. If I'm too fast, let me know. If I'm too slow, also let me know. And because of all these problems, there's a poor crop where farmers cannot sustain themselves. And these are some of the possible ways in which the constraints that are affecting the agricultural sector can be addressed in order to achieve.
So moving on in our syllabus, right? Section 5.4, strategies for economic growth and development. So she's identified the common characteristics of the countries in the region. She's identified which sector of the economy she wishes to focus on, or which area of economic development she's focusing on. Then she talked about, within that area, specific obstacles countries are facing. Now she's moving on to strategies, guys. So this is almost better than I could have asked for as far as organization of her presentation. Last class, I asked my C block to start taking notes at this point in the presentation. So if you think you may want to talk about agriculture as an area for economic development in your own presentation a month from now, this might be a place to jot down some of the what Dr. Forichi explains as the more greatest potential areas for actually achieving some improvement. So if you're interested, you take notes. Yeah.
Would it be possible to actually put this PowerPoint on?
I'm recording it right now. So yes, it will be on any platforms. Okay. So that's also possible. Okay.
Okay. So do we go through or?
Yeah, I think you did a great job last period highlighting what you think are some of the more important strategies for improvements.
Okay. I'll just briefly discuss each item, but development and promotion of suitable technologies for the farmers for their use within their climatic environment and socioeconomic context. I think this is an important area. For example, the technologies that exist in the developed world could be adapted through research with the farmers, and then the farmers can choose what works for them. And then empowering women. The majority of these smallholder farmers are women, and they do most of the field activities like planting, weeding, harvesting. So if these women are given more power to make decisions about their agricultural activities within their homesteads or households, and also if they are able to access more agricultural inputs, maybe they could help to increase productivity. And then policies, I think this is common, and because most of the farmers are failing to access the necessary inputs, maybe governments or certain programs could consider subsidizing the initial phase of changing these farmers from subsistence farming into commercial farmers, and helping them to access the necessary equipment and input. And then improved credit access or financing. It's almost a catch-22 issue. The farmers do not have collateral which the banks can use to provide financing to them. And at the same time, maybe if the banks provided financing to the farmers, they would be able to generate some income and have some collateral. So it's an issue that continues, but still these rural farmers, they do not have ready access to credit.
Have you ever seen a micro credit scheme successfully implemented in Southern Africa, where farmers don't need capital, rather if they appear creditworthy, they can get a loan without having the collateral? I mean, where they don't need the collateral to get the loan? I know that's been used quite a bit in South Asia, in Brazil. We're going to focus on microcredit later this week in class. But have you seen that work in Africa yet?
I think there are several visions that have been availed, like through savings clubs, where farmers come together and then maybe they are given a certain level of funding to kickstart their activities, and then later on they invest what they are reaping. And there are also discussions currently to use the warehouse system, where maybe farmers, after harvesting their grain, they can store the grain at a central storage facility, and then they get a receipt indicating how much grain they have stored and how much it is worth, and they could use that receipt as a collateral to go and access, but it's still under discussion. Yeah.
So it's almost like it's like a grain bank.
Yeah, like
you
a
deposit
grain
your
bank.
grain, but then you can borrow money against
Exactly.
that.
You can draw down. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, capacity building. This is required throughout. The farmers may not be aware of good technologies that can help them, or the extension workers who are supporting the farmers, sometimes they are also not aware or familiar of some of these technological developments. And market linkages, there are cases where farmers have been linked to input and output markets, whereby private sector companies, based on a certain commodity, for example, cotton, they provide inputs like seed, fertilizer, and herbicides to the farmers to grow maybe cotton or tobacco, and then in turn they sell back their produce to them. Infrastructure development, I think this I don't need to emphasize. Reducing post-harvest losses, I think, can also go a long way. It's ironic that in a region where hunger is high, post-harvest losses are also high. Whatever the farmers are producing, a good proportion of that is lost through either insect damage or through rotting due to poor storage facilities. There's need to diversify production within the smallholder sector and commercialize it. If farmers are taught on how to grow some of the commercial crops, they might be able to generate more income than they are currently doing. Then increasing productivity through use of fertilizer or manure or compost, or better disease control in an integrated way. Then climate mitigation through small-scale irrigation. There are some good examples of small-scale irrigation schemes where the smallholder farmers are now generating income from vegetables or other crops. And then building assets for the poor, like pass-on schemes for livestock, where people they receive animals like goats or cows, and then when these bear little ones, the little ones are passed on, like if they are female, so that the next beneficiary can also utilize them. Then social protection measures, addressing soil and land degradation issues, small-scale agro-processing. Most of the farmers are just producing primary products and selling them. And maybe they could earn a little bit more by adding value to their products before they sell. And this last bullet, increased public and private sector investment into agricultural research and development is really crucial.
One of the things we talked about in my class last week, it was mentioned in the article about free trade coffee. Remember that example of the company in Costa Rica, where the UK, there's a company in the UK that imports coffee from Costa Rica, but it's already been roasted, packaged, and branded so that by the time the British consumer buys it, a much larger proportion of what you pay per kilogram goes back to the Costa Rican community where it was processed. So we also learned in that same article that something like 80% of the coffee we drink in Europe is roasted in Europe. So only the raw beans are imported from Africa, Latin America, or Southeast Asia where they're grown. So most of the value is added here in Europe. But a project like this that allows for the processing of the commodity, the raw commodity, into something closer to a finished product. Can you guys imagine how that, now you've taken the commodity base and you've added a manufacturing sector on top of it. And as we've discussed extensively, secondary sectors are generally higher productivity and provide higher incomes. So it's not like you have to, make electronics and textiles in Africa. You could process the raw materials that are already there into higher value products that when we, and as we'll see later in the presentation, the vast majority of Africa's exports go to Europe, believe it or not to each other, not to Asia, not to America. They go to Europe. So when we ultimately consume these products, much more of what we spend on it is going back to the Africans. Yeah.
I have a question. Maybe we say that the pilot should be taught about the different technologies and they should be given information about how to commercialize their crops. But should it be responsible for that? Is that the government or outside companies investing or charities? Or who would be most responsible for the education?
I think the primary responsibility for capacity building is with the government. And due to the issues that I've already highlighted, like no investment into agriculture, the people working within the agricultural sector have limited capacity in terms of mobility, even attending courses where they can learn more. And this is where sometimes the development partners come in to support. The government might have identified capacity building as a constraint, and if resources are still inadequate, then charities or other development partners might assist.
Any more questions about these different strategies? Okay.
This is just an example from Malawi to show some of the main products that are imported. For example, Malawi imports a lot of wheat, and in 2008, wheat imports only were costing close to $76 million US. And by the following year, they'd gone to about 81 million. And if there's a way of having more wheat produced within the country, it would actually assist the governments to save on spending on food imports, and then they can invest in other needy sectors like education and health. Well, they do import, but they also export. Malawi exports a lot of tobacco. I'll briefly talk about parts of what I was doing before I came to Switzerland when I was with the Food and Agriculture Organization, where we were supporting vulnerable farmers to recover from various shocks caused by maybe price increases, like the 2008 incident where prices were very high, much higher beyond the reach of most households in this region. And also, if there's a drought, we would also come up with projects that will help the farmers to recover from the drought by producing even after the drought, or if there's a flood, coming up with response or mitigation measures. And in general, some of the activities included improving the farmers' access to inputs and market linkages through either seed distribution or contract farming, and then also trying to promote improved production techniques, because when the farmers receive the seed, one would like the seeds to be put to better use and produce better. So we promoted improved techniques such as conservation agriculture and small livestock projects, then pest and disease control. There are transboundary pests and diseases like red locust, which can travel thousands of kilometers and cause damage to several countries within the region, or diseases such as the foot and mouth in the livestock sector, and then trying to improve post-harvest handling issues. So the background to this technique that I'm going to explain, conservation agriculture, is that conventionally or normally people would plow their land in order to prepare it so that they can plant the seed. But continued exposure of the soil to the sun and the rain has been shown to lead to degradation of the soil, and the soil loses its capacity to support crop growth. So in this picture here, these farmers are plowing, but it's too late, because if you look at the grass, it's already green. It means the rains have been there for a long time, and these farmers are late because maybe they didn't have their own animals to pull this plow, so they were waiting for neighbors to finish their planting so that they could either borrow or hire. So in conservation farming, we're promoting techniques that are suitable for various categories of farmers. And those farmers who do not own any animals can just use a hand hoe, where during the dry season they go and dig their fields. They dig holes that maybe 15 centimeters by 15 centimeters by 20 centimeters, and then they leave them. When the rains come, these holes are ready. They can quickly go and plant without a lot of effort. And this is a germplanter, which can help even those farmers without animals to plant more easily. Then there is this direct seeder imported from Brazil and now being adapted into this local one in Zimbabwe, and several other pieces of equipment for farmers without draft power, but also commercial farmers can also use conservation agriculture. And according to research, this technique can increase yield by up to 200%.
A quick question about technology. A tool like the a direct seeder, that kind of does the job that used to take more than one person to do. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So this is just a perfect example, guys, of how technology increases productivity, right? That would actually free up labor to work in other fields, or to maybe attend school or go seek work in a city somewhere, because that one machine plows and seeds at the same time, as opposed to the previous picture where you saw the people following the plow seeding. So it's such simple technology, And it's something that's now being made within Africa as well. So there's more jobs being created in the manufacture of the technology itself.
Mm-hmm. And besides, it doesn't open up all the soil. It only opens up like 20% of the soil. So most of the soil remains undisturbed. And that helps to preserve the soil. One of the advantages, this graph is showing timing of field preparation. And this is under conservation agriculture. You see, farmers can start as soon as they finish harvesting in April, and they can spread the labor to as far as they can extend without delaying planting. But with the conventional method, most of the work happens in a very short time, and it's very labor intensive, but also one can easily miss the optimum planting period if they have to wait for livestock. Yeah. And through conservation agriculture, farmers can rotate crops or mix them in different associations, and this diversifies cropping. The legumes, they fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it available to either the crops that they are growing together with or to the next crop. And awareness and training is a major component of this whole technology, because farmers and even the extension workers have been used to the conventional way of farming, and introducing this new method means that they all have to be trained and understand the procedures and some of the reasons why things are done. Yeah, and this is in Kenya, where there's a big company that is now manufacturing some of this equipment for sale in the region, because importing from Brazil was quite expensive. And demonstrating to the farmers on how these pieces of equipment work is very critical, because they are specific in the way that they work. And the good thing is the framework which the farmers used before can be adapted to use a conservation farming tool. So those are some of the issues that farmers are also taught. And it is also important to sensitize the policy and decision makers about these new technologies, because they are the ones who make budgetary allocations. And if they are not aware of the importance of these, they might not allocate adequate resources. So what we did was we invited high-level government officials and took them to Zambia, where conservation agriculture was already being practiced by so many farmers, so that they could see the evidence in the field. And by so doing, they would go back and include these technologies as they dialogue at the policy level. And when their junior people come with proposals on conservation agriculture, at least they do understand what it means. Then there's need for more research across the board on livestock, on crops, to adapt new technologies. The use of agroforestry in sustainable agriculture. I think I mentioned that there are high levels of deforestation. People have been cutting down trees in a way to open up land for agricultural purposes. But because of cutting down trees, the soil became vulnerable to the elements and is being washed away. So agroforestry is trying to bring back trees on farms so that farmers can also diversify, because some of the trees fix nitrogen and some of them they can harvest the biomass or the leaves and feed to their livestock during the dry season. Can agriculture really help SADC countries to develop? I don't know, what do you think? What do you guys think? Do you think agriculture can help Southern Africa to develop economically?
You guys have studied this for a while now. We've talked about different strategies for development and how different growth and development models. Is agriculture development a strategy for human development that is sustainable and achievable? Yeah.
I was going to consider it such a large proportion. Consider it such an important sector of the economy. It's important to develop agriculture. A large proportion of the population as well.
Other thoughts? What about the claim that, no, it's manufacturing that will lead to higher incomes and economic growth? These countries should focus exclusively on developing a secondary sector where incomes can be higher. That's an argument. That's the model that China has used, and we always look at China as an example of successful growth. Matt?
With 80% of the population in agricultural-based jobs, get them to get out of that agriculture, get into manufacturing, so you need to develop agriculture as it's been presented with technology to do the job of 3 people with 1 person, and then you have 2 people who can then move into the new sector that you want to develop. So the development of agriculture leads to the development of other sectors.
It enables it, yeah. Okay. You want to add? Same idea. Yeah. Anybody else have ideas? You guys agree with Matt on that? Yeah. You can't develop a secondary sector until you have an agricultural sector that can feed not just the farmers themselves, but the rest of the population. That's a really good point. So that's kind of what Dr. Forichi works in, is increasing that sustainability and productivity of the agricultural sector. One thing that dawned on me during this presentation was this idea that, oh my gosh, population growth is the biggest threat to Africa. Because we're going to have more famine, more hunger as populations grow. And we saw the growth rate is quite high. I mean, compared to Europe, we've seen the population go from 244 million in that region to 277 million in 4 years. That's much faster than Europe's growing. But should we be afraid of famine based on what we've seen in this presentation today? When we realize that countries like Malawi or Lesotho are producing at 10% of the productivity of South Africa, one of their neighbors, as far as the yields of the essential food crops. What do you guys think? Is famine a real problem if we can tackle the productivity issue in agriculture? No. We should reduce hunger and famine if productivity in agriculture increases, even if populations continue to grow. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah, I found that interesting because the population growth rates were quite high. But compared to food productivity, it's like if we could just get productivity up to the same level as South Africa, you can feed that growing population and not depend on imported food either.
Yeah, I think the 3 responses are very well integrated.
Yeah.
And SADC also feels that the heads of state in the African Union, they feel that agriculture is one of the first avenues for improving their economies and the welfare of their populations and meeting the Millennium Development Goals. And according to the World Bank estimates, they say a 10% increase in crop yield could reduce by 9% the proportion of people surviving on less than $1 per day. So that's another important attribute. And IFPRI also alludes to the fact that if farm incomes increased by like $1, the rural incomes would increase by $0.5 to $1.5. And I think Mr. Walter can explain what to explain to the other class.
Remember macroeconomics, guys? We talked about an increase in income leads to further increases in income through what? What do we call that? Yeah, it's like a multiplier effect, right? So not only will the farmers themselves see their incomes rise, but everybody in the rural communities will see their incomes rise. Because with rising farm incomes comes rising demand for other goods and services, so you can build up an entire rural economy instead of just seeing this rural to urban migration in which the people in the countryside remain poor. Rather, through farm productivity, you can increase incomes in all of the countryside. But look at that figure right there. 10% increase in crop yields can reduce the proportion of people living in absolute poverty by 9%. That means a 50% increase in crop yields can reduce poverty in Africa by almost 50%, 45%. That's incredible when you consider that some of the countries in southern Africa are only producing at 10% the yield of the rest of the world. So you get them you don't even have to narrow that gap all the way. Just narrow that gap slightly and you can reduce poverty in Africa significantly. So it seems like there's a lot of hope in agriculture as an economic development strategy. And we are almost up. We have what, one more minute, guys? Okay, but this was a great presentation. And there's another point on here that I thought we could point out as well. Promoting regional integration and, where was it, trade, agricultural trade. If we had a few more minutes, we would see that 20% of the food being grown in Africa is being exported to Europe alone, I think. Or was it more? What was that slide?
This one. Yeah.
40%, almost 40%. So she talked about intranational trade as well. Breaking down the barriers to trade within African countries can increase the percentage of the exports that go to their own neighbors. And then we can talk about free trade areas, trading blocks, preferential trade agreements. One second, guys. Okay, so there's lots of connections to everything from macroeconomics, we talk about the multiplier effects of rising incomes, to microeconomics, we talk about the access to markets, to international economics, we talk about free trade and reducing barriers to trade, and all that comes back to development economics. Yeah, Max?
Why is it that there's so much is exported to the user just because the prices are the highest?
We have the money. We're the consumers of the world, right? Especially for Africa. I mean, you can see USA is quite low, but that's probably geographical, right? US imports more from South America than it does from Africa. But yeah, we are where the consumers are. But as incomes rise in Africa, you'll see more intra-African trade between nations. All right, guys, I'm going to post this presentation on with Dr. Forichi's permission. I'll post it to my website, but also make sure it's in Classwork so you guys can download an original. And I've been recording this as well, along with Dr. Forichi's presentation. So let's hear a big round of applause for the recording. I hope to provide some of you guys with inspiration for your own research projects you'll begin this week. And here's my promise. By the end of today, you guys will get a copy of paper 3 from your mock, because you're going to get to see that before the exam. And you'll get a PDF copy of the research assignment you're going to begin this week as well.
Is that for Howard's class?
Yeah, I'll make sure Howard gets it to his class.